Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to my webisodes on dyslexia and autism. In this particular webisode, we're going to be talking about some of the difficulties of adulthood with dyslexia and then a little bit of childhood. In the past, we've talked about diagnosis, and one of the struggles that many people deal with these days, as opposed to when I was a child in the early 80s, is getting a diagnosis. Again, we've covered in the past that generally, if you suspect your child has dyslexia or older child or you, getting a diagnosis many times means that you're going to go to an autism specialist because that's what's most prevalent and that's where the umbrella of all these diagnoses, everything sort of falls under that umbrella. But let me tell you the challenges you're going to get into. Unfortunately, all of us have had this experience with insurances of various types, whether it's car or homeowners insurance, where those particular industries sort of treat you like a criminal and like you're trying to take something from them when you make a claim. And getting a diagnosis is very similar. Essentially, that diagnosis grants you the rights and privileges to being helped along, whether that's educationally or financially. And because of that, there's a real defensive mentality when it comes to getting that diagnosis. And the hierarchy, the government is who runs these things, the programs that are going to benefit you, set things up in a way that makes it counterintuitive and more difficult just because they have this sense that there's all these people fraudulently looking for a diagnosis. And in reality, maybe it's not even that they suspect that it's fraudulent, they just want to slow down the process, much like an RTI program is set up to slow down the diagnosis in a school system. You know, that's what you're up against. Know that going into it. So persistence is going to be required. You're going to be up against people wanting multiple documentations. You're going to have to go to specific places to get your diagnosis. But you can persevere and you can, you know, get through. And I guess the big lesson from all that is the earlier you can get your child a diagnosis, the better. 1, 2, 3, 4. Literally, from as early as you suspect there's an issue, get with a specialist and get them on it. Even what we consider a normal time for diagnosis of dyslexia being, you know, first grade, when they're starting to read, for 2012, that's late. In pre-K, your teacher should have an eye on it if you have a decent teacher. Even before that, at home, you should be looking at a lot of the signs I talked about in previous videos. And if you see any of these things, you'll not only want to ask your pediatrician about it, but if they really have no answers for you, look up your local autistic center, and there'll be one relatively near you. And take your child to them. In general, a consultation and a diagnosis isn't going to cost you anything, and you'll be happier for it, and you'll have a better chance of getting a diagnosis early. Remember that legitimacy and an actual disability is not necessarily the entire criteria to getting a diagnosis, whether that's a disability diagnosis, a medical diagnosis. There's just a lot of factors at play these days. As you get older, the school system sort of takes control of the realm of diagnosis. And if you live in a state like Tennessee, because of liability, they'll want to avoid diagnosis at all costs. Your child may have an IEP from exceptional ed programs and be in that special ed program for years and years and years, and never will they give you a specific word for what your child has. That's not done by the school systems in Tennessee because of the liability. In other places it is, and you can get a diagnosis outside of the school system that will be used by the school system. But you know, that's what my child in Georgia had to go to Tennessee, get a diagnosis for autism, and then come back to Georgia. And luckily we started early. If I had waited till my child was 8, he may not have been diagnosed quite as quickly. And it was still about a 8-9 month process for us. For parents that don't know what they're looking for, it can be a much slower process, and not getting diagnosed till 5 or 6 is a reality. But again, come first grade, 5, 6, 7, you're still in luck. There's still lots of places. There's still everything's free, and there's lots of kids that are going for these services, testing and diagnosis. If you have an older child, a child that sort of slid by those early grades and is now in middle school and high school, it's a little more of a challenge. You're going to have to probably foot a little bit of a bill, because mental health care is not really covered under most medical plans. You're probably going to have to pay for a trained doctor to administer a test. There is some school systems, even college systems, like I know in Georgia, that will do a referral for this test, and sometimes that cost is covered, and sometimes you're going to end up paying $300 to $500 for that testing for the diagnosis. But again, your school system, your exceptional ed teacher should know all about that. And if they don't, go to their boss in the central office of whatever school district you're in. Remember, be demanding as a parent. As a teacher, we hate demanding parents. But as a parent, we realize that playing nice does not always work. The squeaky wheel gets the oil. Their pain in the rear is your gain. So be persistent. Tell them exactly what you want and expect for your child. And if you feel lost, they may not be the best people to ask for advice. Remember, we've talked about this in the past. The school system, the exceptional ed teachers like myself, administrators, they all have multiple agendas, and some of them don't involve your children. Some of them involve employment and money and these sort of things. So ask for advice outside. Find a local dyslexia support group. There's plenty of them on Facebook. Find a local autism group. Find a group that has children in exceptional ed and ask them for advice on what you should do. Remember that if your child has an exceptionality, that the greatest thing you can do for them is keep them in their grade level cohort. Never do you want to get too far behind, especially, for instance, my child with autism will always be autistic, and he will always have these needs and differences from other children. And I could hold him back 10 grades, and still he would have these differences. So make sure that academically your child's getting all the support they need, but also socially, and that they're staying on grade level. Also on the issue of diagnosis and health, even if you have made it to the college level, and say, for instance, you were in a state like Tennessee that doesn't diagnose, and you had this IEP all these years, and you end up at a decent university, seek out through their student services department, and you'll find that you can even pay out of pocket for some of these diagnosis tests in certain states. I know in Georgia, Tennessee's a little behind the game, but that's just the way it goes. And I know a lot more people watch this video than are just those 2 states. And luckily, chances are your state's more equipped than Georgia and Tennessee. So even as a college student, even as a grown adult who's going back to college, check with student services. Find out where these diagnoses are done. Someone has the answers. And if they don't have the answers, find the person that does. And if no one has the answers, get them all together and say, come up with an answer for me. This is your right. If you have a disability, diagnosed or otherwise, you have the legitimate right for someone to give you the proper avenue for diagnosis. And I would also fall back on something we've talked about in other videos, and that's, of course, that every teacher, everywhere along the way, all the way through college, verbalize your disability to them. Let them know that you have this issue and that issue, and this, even if without a diagnosis you're not looking for an exception, but verbalizing these things will not only make you feel better about it, but it'll also enlighten them to your demeanor. Things won't be misinterpreted as laziness or forgetfulness, and they'll realize the work you're putting in, because a lot of times perception is reality, and you don't want them to perceive that you're not doing your best. I hope this helps. Get a diagnosis as early as possible, and I'll be back next week with another webisode. Thanks. Have a good day.